So the branches of the anterior cerebral artery. These are the branches of the anterior cerebral artery and segments in the neurosurgical nomenclature, the A1, A2 and A3. Now we will see the middle cerebral artery. There are two terminal branches of the internal carotid artery, the anterior cerebral artery, and the larger one or continuation of the internal carotid artery is the middle cerebral artery. And mainly this artery supplies blood to the lateral surface of the cerebral hemisphere. Some part of the lateral surface is also supplied by the posterior cerebral artery in the posterior most part or the occipital lobe, where the anastomosis between the middle cerebral and posterior cerebral artery is taking place. So the middle cerebral artery the lateral surface of the cerebral artery the lateral fissure is here, and this is the outline of the posterior ramus of lateral sulcus and central sulcus of Rolando. So after piercing the anterior perforated substance, the middle cerebral artery is entering in the lateral fissure. Before entering in the lateral fissure, the artery bifurcates or trifurcates. So in same way as we have seen in the anterior cerebral artery, here also in surgical nomenclature, the M1, M2, M3 and M4 divisions of the artery. So from its beginning up to bifurcation or trifurcation, the segment is M1. The artery, when the artery is in the lateral fissure, that segment is M2. So when the artery is in the lateral fissure, this is M2. So M1 and M2. M1 is also known as sphenoidal. And M2 is also known as insular. M3 is the segment which is coming out from the lateral fissure, and that is known as M3 or opercular. Then artery is running upwards and backwards in the posterior ramus of the cerebral hemisphere. So segment which is coming out is the M3 or opercular. Opercular. And finally M4 is cortical. So all together 6 or 7 branches arising from the middle cerebral artery which are cortical, but some central branches are also arising in same way as we have seen in the anterior cerebral artery. So two types of arteries, the central which are supplying blood to subcortical areas of the cerebrum, and the cortical which are supplying the cortices, different areas of the cerebral cortex. And these branches are clinically very important because these are supplying blood to the somatosensory area and primary motor area, except the area for the lower limbs, and also the motor speech area and auditory area in dominant cerebral hemisphere. So after coming out the lateral fissure, artery is running backwards and upwards in the posterior ramus of the lateral sulcus. So branches of the middle cerebral artery is lenticulostriate artery. This central branch, lenticulostriate artery. This artery is running backwards and laterally in the area of the external capsule and claustrum. So artery is running backwards and laterally. This is the lenticulostriatal artery, and dividing in medial and lateral branches. The lateral branch of the lenticulostriate artery of the middle cerebral artery was first demonstrated in cerebral hemorrhage by Charcot. So also known as Charcot's artery of cerebral hemorrhage. This artery is responsible for supply to the caudate nucleus, the lentiform nucleus which is having globus pallidus, and the putamen, the genu and anterior limb of the internal capsule, claustrum, megadeloid body and external capsule. These all are receiving blood from the lenticulostriate artery, especially the lateral branch of lenticulostriatal artery, which is known as lateral striate artery or artery of Charcot, also known as artery of cerebral hemorrhage of the Charcot. Now the cortical branches. Anterior temporal artery, the anterior temporal artery. This artery is supplying blood to anterior part of the outer surface of the temporal lobe. The anterior part of the outer surface of temporal lobe. The orbitofrontalis, a big artery supplying the blood. The orbital branch is supplying to the inferior frontal gyrus and lateral part of orbital surface of the frontal lobe. The frontal branch is supplying blood to the superior and inferior frontal gyri. So this branch is orbitofrontalis. Frontalis. This artery is known as Rolandic artery. Why this artery is known as Rolandic, I will explain later. Rolandic. This is known as pre-Rolandic. And this artery is Rolandic. This is Rolandic. With the central sulcus, the lateral sulcus is known as Sulcus of Sylvius. In the same way, the name of the central sulcus of cerebral hemisphere is known as the central sulcus of Rolando. So arteries are named as the pre-Rolandic and Rolandic arteries. These are supplying blood to primary motor cortex, the premotor area, and also some part of the sensory area, the somatosensory area of the cerebral hemisphere. The anterior and posterior parietal arteries. These are the anterior and posterior parietal arteries. The anterior parietal artery, the posterior parietal artery. These two arteries are supplying blood to the superior and inferior parietal lobules. But remember, a strip in this part is receiving blood from the branches of the anterior cerebral artery, that are the callosomarginal and pericallosal arteries. So this strip is receiving blood from the branches of anterior cerebral arteries. So anterior and posterior parietal arteries are for the superior parietal lobule and inferior parietal lobule, some part of the somatosensory area also here. So very dangerous situation can be created when the artery is blocked or ruptured. can lead to sensory loss or can lead to motor paralysis of the muscles. The posterior temporal artery. For the posterior part of the temporal lobe. And finally, the artery is terminating as angular artery. Angular artery. So these are the branches of the middle cerebral artery. These are known as M4 segment or cortical. So there are 4 nomenclatured segments: M1, M2, M3 and M4. Sphenoidal, the insular, opercular and the cortical. So this all area, the lateral part of the hemisphere, is supplied by the branches of the middle cerebral artery. This part behind the angular artery is supplied by branches of the posterior cerebral artery, and this place is the site of anastomosis in the middle cerebral artery branches and posterior cerebral artery branches. So in the brain there are many anastomoses between the branches of the anterior cerebral artery, the posterior cerebral artery, the middle cerebral artery, the posterior inferior cerebellar artery, superior cerebellar artery and anterior inferior cerebral arteries. But inside the brain substance, when the artery is entering inside the brain through PL plexus or directly inside, they never anastomose. So anastomoses are taking place primarily inside the sulci. The sulci are the primary site of the anastomosis, but when the artery is coming out from sulci on the surface of the brain or the PL plexus, they enter at right angle inside the brain parenchyma and they never anastomose. So this is the middle cerebral artery. Now after a short break, I will talk about the vertebral or vertebro-basilar arterial system of the brain.